And now we have the last speaker, but definitely not the least, Robert Griffiths, from the he's the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain. Take it away.
My first task is to bring you greetings from the Communist Party of Britain and its members, its executive committee, and apologies that 50 of our leading trade union comrades are at a residential school this weekend at the General Federation of Trade Unions hotel in Loughborough. Were it not for that, I'm sure quite a few of them would be able to be with us today. My third task, comrades, is to cross out most of the notes that I'd made in preparation for this speech, because so much of it has been said before, more expertly in many cases than I could possibly have said it. We've heard, for example, about China in the struggle for peace, including, if we go back just a few decades, the way in which China has not so much been rewritten out of history, but the role that China played in the global struggle against fascism was never written in the first place. It hasn't been rewritten. It's been written out from the beginning, from 1949. And yet China played such a critical role, not just in the struggle in the Far East, but contributing so much to the ability of the Soviet Union, another country, of course, whose role in the Second World War has been rewritten and to some extent even written out of history in the West, enabled the Soviet Union to play its absolutely central role in the defeat of fascism in the West. After the Second World War, of course, we had the Cold War. And with the Cold War, based as it was on the biggest lie of the 20th century, which was that the Soviet Union, after losing 27 million people and having to rebuild literally thousands of cities, towns and villages, together with playing a key role in rebuilding the devastated parts of Poland, Czechoslovakia and Eastern Germany, nevertheless was just champing at the bit to invade Western Europe and have another world war. That was the big lie that was used to justify, of course, the formation of NATO. And then on top of that, after 1949 in particular, we were fed a slight variant on that big lie, but still a big lie in itself, that the Red Peril in the East also threatened peace and stability across that part of the world. And with the formation of NATO, of course, since then, ever since then, even after the winding up of the Warsaw Pact, NATO, which was established 6 years before the Warsaw Pact, NATO has continued to expand, and in tandem with the European Union, all the way eastwards to the very borders of Russia. And while I mention the European Union, let's also not forget, this is for the benefit of any Guardian readers there may be with us today, some of whom have some very strange ideas that the European Union was a wonderful construction in the interests of peace and international cooperation. It should be recalled that the first attempts to establish pan-Western European organizations were first of all the attempt to establish a European defence community, as they called it, in Western Europe, clearly aimed at Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and also, in addition to that, the European political community to go with it, that was only defeated by the joint forces of the French Gaullists and the French Communist Party, who defeated the proposal in the French National Assembly that led to the collapse of the European political community and the end of the moves to establish a European defence community. based incidentally on the rearmament of West Germany. And only after that did those who were so keen to establish this anti-socialist bloc in Western Europe, only after that did they decide to go at it from a different direction, to begin with economic cooperation and economic structures instead of political and military structures. They would follow, of course, as they have been doing over the last 20 years, and we've seen the acceleration in the militarization of the European Union, working so closely now in tandem with NATO. And yet, when it comes to questions of peace and war, our headlines are not filled with these realities. We're warned about Chinese expansionism. China, which has one military facility outside its own borders, no military bases as such. It's China that is the expansionist power that threatens peace and stability, not the United States, with hundreds of military bases around the world, including those that encircle 2/3 of the borders of China, not NATO, which has expanded, as I say, all the way eastwards, including the new military bases that have been constructed, but it's China. And why? Because the Chinese Navy has been spotted sailing in the South China Sea, which everybody knows is the property of the US Sixth Fleet. That's where you will find the British, American and Australian warships engaging in annual military exercises off the coast of China. And yet we're told it's China that is the expansionist power and that threatens peace and stability. And incidentally, of course, again, just to insert a dose of reality here, if one just compares China's military expenditure, by any measurement you like, percentage of GDP, amount spent per head of population, amount spent in total, is still only a fraction of American military expenditure, about 1/5 by most of those measures. And yet again, it's China that we're warned is on the warpath. How extraordinary, and what a complete inversion of the real situation. Although let's give President Trump some credit. He has decided to rename his department the Ministry of War instead of the Ministry of Defense. I think it's probably the only time that Trump has been caught out telling the truth about anything in the last 12 months. We've heard today marvelous contributions about China's role in international solidarity, about the assistance it's given and the solidarity that it's giving to Cuba, to Venezuela. Let's not also forget the increasingly warm relations now with Vietnam, playing an important role in financing projects in Vietnam. And of course, we've heard today about the Belt and Road Initiative. We've heard about its role in BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. And let's not forget the increasing role that China has been playing in the United Nations, the way in which it has been supporting the different peacekeeping operations by the UN around the world, the way in which it stepped in to fill the funding gap left by the United States in terms of development aid. And this also should remind us, we need to be very careful as friends of China, as progressives, as socialists, as communists. We need to be very careful not to join in the general rubbishing of the United Nations. That is part of the United States and imperialism's agenda. Ever since the United States lost the ability to bribe and bully the majority of member states in the General Assembly, up until that time, the United States supported all kinds of operations as far as the United Nations were concerned, because they could bribe and bully the majority in the General Assembly. They can't do that anymore. They lose vote after vote in the General Assembly, and therefore they have to increasingly use their veto. And of course, it's been a quite conscious, deliberate policy of the United States, wherever necessary, to serve imperialism's interests, to sideline and to undermine the authority and the resources and the potential role of the United Nations. So we should be very careful in our disappointment, of course, in terms of what the United Nations has been unable to do and cannot do. We should be very careful that we don't slide over to imperialism's agenda and say, well, the United Nations, it's all a waste of time, it's a paper tiger, it's finished. That is exactly what the United States wants us to conclude. And instead of weakening the United Nations, we should be looking at the ways in which it can be strengthened and the ways in which resources can be increased. And of course, linked to that, the kind of practical demands that can be put on the United Nations, including those that expose the real role of American and Western imperialism generally. We've heard as well today about other aspects of internationalism, and Geroy, just before he went, he compelled me to cross out another couple of lines of my original notes. But he did mention the growing role of the Communist Party of China in the international communist movement. Every year there is an international meeting of communist and workers' parties. It's the biggest gathering of communists and their parties in the world, outside possibly of Keith Bennett's annual birthday parties. We have 80, 90, 100 communist parties and workers' parties and national liberation movements. We meet, we exchange views, we sign statements of solidarity and so on. We've even been coordinating more activities in recent years. And China's role in that, the role of the Chinese party in that, has been growing and growing and growing. And they've taken on more positions and more responsibilities. And that's very much to be welcome. And by the way, I think it should be noted as well that at those meetings and in its relations with communist parties around the world, the Chinese party treats other parties strictly on the basis of equality of status, mutual respect, non-interference in the internal affairs of other parties. And so even the smaller communist parties, like ours in Britain, we get treated with the same consideration, on the same basis and with the same respect as some of the mass communist parties around the world also enjoy. So the Chinese communists stick very strictly to those principles of relations between communist parties in the same way that they do in terms of relations between countries. And I think it's important, of course, that continues. We've heard about China's enormous advances in the field of science, in the fields of science and technology. Green, sustainable development. And I couldn't help but notice, if any of you had the unfortunate experience to endure the speech that Trump delivered at the United Nations just recently, he actually made mention of China's role in the manufacture and export of the dreaded windmill. Terrible, terrible things Trump told the leaders of the other countries at the UN. Don't forget, a windmill has been erected within sight of his Scottish golf course. And he is not going to forgive those responsible. But he said, China is quite happy to manufacture and export windmills, as he liked to call them, wind turbines, we also know them as. It exports these on a massive scale, he said, and of course, these terrible things, they're very careful that they don't use them inside China. Well, I'm sorry, we've had some facts and figures before us, but I remember on my first visit to China 20 years ago, on the coach journey into Xinjiang, the Uyghur province, On the outskirts of the capital city, Urumqi, there were miles and miles of wind turbines, windmills, that supplied the whole of that city and the surrounding area with green renewable energy. That was back then. And we've heard today about the extent to which that technology is now being deployed, along with solar power, across large tracts of China. We've heard about China's enormous advances in terms of its economy and social development and so on. And it's very important, I think I think it was Carlos who made this point very, very strongly. Other speakers have made the point. But let us never forget that such enormous achievements as the elimination of absolute poverty for 800 million people in China has been carried out on the basis of socialism, of a socialist economy, of public ownership of key industries and services, of a centralized economic plan on the basis of strict control and regulation over private capital. And let's not forget as well, on the basis, yes, of Communist Party rule. That's what China has achieved, and that's the basis on which they've achieved it. Not because they've embraced capitalism, which is the Western propaganda version, explanation for China's enormous progress. Of course, China has made use of capital, of private capital. It's made use of market forces, but they've always been subject to the central economic plan. They've also been subject, absolutely, to Chinese state power, with the Communist Party in the ruling position. Lenin would have recognized that strategy, even though he didn't live to see the fruits of it in terms of the stimulation it gave to the development of Russia's economy in the 1920s. And then we have to contrast the enormous achievements. Anybody who's been to the many massive new railway stations, who's been on those high-speed trains, you're going at 180 miles an hour, and there's none of the shaking and so on that you experience just travelling at 60 miles an hour between Cardiff and Bristol. You're going on this high-speed train, and you compare the thousands and thousands of miles of new railway line and the new stations, and you compare that within Britain. I don't think we've managed to build HS2 as far as Birmingham yet, and we've already cancelled the second part of it. What a contrast, what an enormous contrast between socialist China and capitalist Britain. We've also heard today about China's role in terms of promoting human rights. The human rights that actually matter to hundreds of millions of people in developing countries, as well as the democratic rights that, of course, will be and follow along behind that. I remember at a dinner after one international delegation had been to China, and we had a dinner with a leading Politburo member afterwards. And in the middle of the dinner, I was sitting next to him, his mobile phone went off. And he picked up the phone, he had a brief couple of words in Chinese. Unfortunately, my Chinese is a bit rusty, so I couldn't quite follow the conversation. But he was a little bit down. And I said afterwards, was that bad news, comrade? And he said, well, yes, in a way. There have been local elections in my home village, and a close friend of mine was defeated. So I said, what? He was a Communist Party candidate and he's just been defeated in local elections. He said, no, everybody has to stand as an independent. I said, well, why is that? He said, because if they stood as Communist Party candidates, they'd almost certainly be elected. That is the prestige of the Communist Party of China in many localities. He said, my close friend was an independent, he's been defeated, and I'm a little bit sad about it. And when we come back to human rights, well, no, before we leave democratic rights, I mean, when we talk about those hundreds of millions in China who've been rescued from absolute poverty, do you think their priority really, in place of that, would have been that they don't have the right to a party led by the Chinese equivalent of Keir Starmer or Nigel Farage, or Kemi bad enough? Of course not. Of course not. What they needed was to be rescued from hunger, from disease, from ignorance. That is what the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese government has delivered for so many people in China. Of course, the expansion of democratic rights, of popular participation, and so on, will continue to take place in China. But why on earth would they want it to take the Western form? The corruption, the big business financing, the outside influences. Why would they want that system? That's not how democracy will develop in China. And before I leave that and come to just my last contribution, the last part of my contribution, of course we're also, whenever we stand up for China and we defend China's record and so on, we're confronted with the hoary old question, but what about genocide in Xinjiang, in the Uyghur province? And stop me if you've heard this before. Looking around, I think some of you have. I went to Xinjiang province just a few years after the first outbreak of Islamic fundamentalist and separatist terrorism. I went to Xinjiang. We went to different places, we met different people, we were quite free to walk around wherever we wanted and so on. And when I got back, one of the first things I did, in those days I must admit, occasionally I did buy The Guardian. When I came back, I opened The Guardian and there was a report from the president of the World Uyghur Congress, set up with American money in the United States, then moved to Germany. The World Uyghur Congress president was addressing the European Parliament, and he was explaining the terrors that were being inflicted upon the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. Their language was being crushed. They weren't allowed to speak it. All the public signs and notices are in Han Chinese only. All the mosques have been closed. And all the officials of the state and the party in the province were all run by Han Chinese imports. That's what the speech said. I'd just been there. Now, either our Chinese comrades had constructed this Potemkin village or province and filled it full of Han Chinese, or I'd actually seen quite a different Xinjiang. We'd gone to the market. Most of the people there were speaking Uyghur. Any public sign and notice, the first language on the sign was Uyghur, followed by Mandarin, or one of the other Chinese languages, usually Mandarin, and then Russian. There's a long-standing small Russian community, trilingual signs. By the way, we had hundreds of people in Wales imprisoned in the non-violent direct action struggle for bilingual signs in Wales, with the Welsh language on, even in Welsh-speaking areas. But there were these trilingual signs. And what's more, of course we visited mosques that were open. When we met the capital city administration, and when we met the leadership of the Communist Party in Xinjiang Autonomous Region, our interpreters had to stand down that we brought with us from Beijing. Why? They told us why. They said, we don't speak Uyghur, and the Uyghur comrades you're going to meet, they want to speak their own language. We can't translate from Uyghur into English and English into Uyghur, so they're supplying their own translators. Now, we were told by the president of the World Uyghur Congress that all the top officials in local government and the party were all Han Chinese. Of course, a complete load of nonsense. But who in the European Parliament had just come back from Xinjiang like we had? That fraud who was peddling this nonsense, of course, was not challenged by anybody. And it certainly wouldn't be challenged by The Guardian itself. But this is the kind of falsification that is taking place on this enormous scale. The Uyghur people must be the only victims of genocide who see their proportion of the Chinese population and their absolute numbers actually growing from one census to the next. I didn't think that's how genocide was supposed to work. complete and utter nonsense. But the ideal way in which to counteract that, of course, is to try and go. You can go. Westerners are not prevented from going to Xinjiang. And in fact, the Morning Star had a delegation to Xinjiang quite recently, and its international editor, Roger Mackenzie, wrote a superb series of articles in the Morning Star. This is the reality of Xinjiang. This is what I've seen in Xinjiang. And it doesn't match the Western propaganda in the slightest. So, comrades, not only do we all have a job as ambassadors of China, explaining the realities of China and the great advances being made by China and the internationalism practiced by the Chinese state and government and ruling party, we also have to be travel agents. I know that might be putting Keith and Carlos out of a job, but we need to be encouraging more people, organising delegates. We need to get some more trade unionists out there so we can counteract some of the nonsense being talked on that front. But these are things that we all can do. By the way, I'm a bit obsessed with Guardian readers at the moment. I don't know what that might be. But look, if there's anybody here not reading the Morning Star every day, what paper are you supporting? This is the only national paper that tells the truth about China and is in solidarity with China. And if you're not reading the Morning Star, why not? I'll be checking with the circulation manager at the end of next week. I'll want to know how many new orders have been placed for the Morning Star in newsagents up and down Britain. I hope it's going to be at least 25, 30 or 40. We need to support the paper that supports the work of Friends of Socialist China. So, comrades, I think it's been a wonderful day with absolutely superb contributions. I know there'll be plans to publish some of them. But I would like to end by just saying, long live peace and internationalism. Long live the Communist Party of China. Long live the People's Republic of China.
Thank you so much for that brilliant summation, Robert. Thank you everyone for joining us. And as you can imagine, a lot of people do not have this very useful and important information. So please go to our YouTube channels at Friends of Socialist China and at Empire Watch, and please share the clips that come out. At Friends of Socialist China, we'll have full panels up.